Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Susan. Thanks so much for making the time for our class on last chance coaching, coaching on a last resort before termination. So looking forward to learning from you and learning more about your experience with this topic. And also just, sharing a space, the collective space with coaches to learn from each other. So first and foremost, I'd like to hand it to you so you can introduce yourself. And if you would like to share a little bit about what you do, I'll go ahead and I'll start on my left, which is Tom.
Well, hi. Nice to be here.
And Tom has the radio voice.
It was great listening to all of you. A little bit about me. I've been executive coaching for over 30 years and have an interesting history with this whole idea of last chance coaching. It's been a thread since the beginning for me, and we can talk about that later. Right now, I coach mostly in large companies like vice presidents and above, and I'm known as the look and sound of leadership guy. That's kind of what I do. So that's one of the things I do.
Thanks, Tom. Susan?
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Haven't been coaching quite as many years as Tom, but since 2007, so quite a few years. Mostly corporate work, 95% corporate work. In particular, my focus the last 5 years or so has been entrepreneurial companies that are in the scale-up phase, and quite often you will find the company's outgrown some of the founding employees, the accountant that was really a bookkeeper, and now they really need a CFO. And how do you deal with that? Because I work with the entrepreneurs to not only raise their leadership skills, but also to build their leadership teams. So what do we do with different people, and helping coach those people is pretty common. I also coach technical, usually directors, C-level and up, because I do have an engineering degree, so that's kind of come my way. Yeah. And quite often, engineers are extremely talented, hard to replace, but they may have some derailing behaviors that have caused complaints to HR, and something has to be done about that, but they don't want to let the person go, but it is a liability if they can't figure out how to get rid of those derailing factors. So I've done quite a bit of this kind of work, and have plenty of case studies to share when the time is right.
Great. Thank you, Susan. And I'll just introduce myself because I realize that some people may be watching this and not familiar with me. So Diana Ideas, I predominantly coach leaders and executives, also work within companies and with entrepreneurs. And I first ran into this when working as an internal coach, where it was just like, hey, coach this person so we don't fire this person. And I share more about my experience later in the class. But those were difficult coaching engagements, and also very difficult for me to manage as a coach. And then now as an external coach, I find that it happens as well. So at times people have money set aside for, hey, we need to solve this problem, or we want to keep this person. They have derailing behaviors, kind of what Susan is saying. And then later that potentially turns into engagements that are more developmental. So this is something that's really shaped me as a coach. But it was something I learned the hard way, and to, some of the sentiments shared before, I didn't want to be learning the hard way when someone else's job depended on it. So that's where this comes from. So thank you for joining us. So first question, just to kind of kick us off, is do you offer last chance coaching, and why or why not? If it's okay, I'll go with Susan, and then Tom will just kind of rotate, but there's only a few of us here today, so speak in as you feel compelled to.
I don't call it last chance coaching, but I certainly have not shied away from that. There are certain things that I want in place in order to do last chance coaching. And I think you have some questions on that, so I'll kind of reserve those thoughts until then. But I do like the challenging coaching assignments, and I can't say I've ever turned down that type of assignment before.
Thanks, Susan.
So do I offer it? The answer is, if you went to my website, you wouldn't know that I offer it. It isn't called out in any way. Like, you've named it here, Diana, and I don't name it in that way. Um, what's interesting is the woman who taught me to coach was a fierce believer that we as coaches are not here to do last chance coaching. So what I really got drilled into me from my mentor was, last chance coaching is a bad thing. Don't do it, because you can never win. But subsequently, as I've just been coaching more people, I've been in the situation and I've taken the work. And so do I offer it? No. Do I do it? Like Susan? Sure. Yeah, sure I do.
Yeah, and I think that's echoing that. I think this is some of the reality that coaches get pulled into. And in Meg, who hosted me on her podcast, who unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight, she talked about just the differences in insurance, right? Whether if you're saying whether someone can be hired or continue in a particular role, that can jeopardize our insurance as coaches. And it's not necessarily something we advertise for, but also I'm moving into the entrepreneurial space myself and establishing myself as a coach. This is some of what came up. So I think that's part of why we come together as a course. It may not be something that we offer or that's listed, but it's maybe part of our reality.
I got to be honest. I'm
Yeah.
thinking about the insurance thing. I don't
Yeah.
get it. Like, I
Really?
carry insurance, but why
Okay.
would that, like, I carry insurance just because the clients that I work with demand that I do. But
Sure.
I've never thought of getting a different policy or any kind of around the last chance. I just assume, like, maybe
Yeah.
someday I'm going to have to testify in court. That may
It's
be.
it's one of the questions, maybe not in all providers, but it's one of the questions that is asked. It doesn't mean that, I don't know that it would mean that you wouldn't get insured, but it maybe changes your rate or level if you're one advising whether people are terminated or not.
It's interesting. I had my insurance through ICF
Okay.
Global, and I wasn't asked that question at all either. So
Well, that's why we come together, right?
I
Because
also, I just want to pick up on something that you just said, Diana, and I don't know if it was something, I don't know if this is a belief of yours, but you said if we were going to be advising about whether people should or shouldn't get fired. And I just want to say, I don't think that's my job. I don't
right.
ever do that, ever. Like, that ain't my job.
that
So,
Yeah.
I totally agree with Tom. That, and when I said I take the assignment, but you're managing expectations up front, it's having a good framework of what I am and am not doing with coaching. And I'm not making a recommendation at the end. We're going to look at, has the behavior changed in a way that you want to keep them or not keep them, but that's up to the coachee and the client, not me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and Tom, great call out. That's the importance of coach role. That's not our role, but that is also something that I will say for myself, having started this as an internal employee, and so then being an HR person in the company, just because it's not your role doesn't mean you won't be asked, right? So, kind of part of why we talk about this and have experienced coaches come in and say, okay, here are the pitfalls, here are some of the reasons to do it or not do it, is for these things. Because one of the difficult things, especially in that executive coaching space, is that the sponsor who's making the investment and has the questions may just be like, well, hey, what do you recommend? I trust you. You've been with me on this journey. And it could be so easy as a human to make that recommendation. But outside of the coaching role, that puts us in a very different situation. So juicy stuff. I know
and
there's
it's,
more.
yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
Absolutely. You get asked that question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I will say, just for my own coach development, I had MCC a few years ago tell me, look, it sounds like you need to be a little bit harder on what you do or don't tell your sponsors. But it was difficult for me, especially as an entrepreneur. The sponsors making this investment, they want to know it's working, but it's also confidential. And so holding that line and holding that kind of triangle can be difficult, especially for coaches who are establishing themselves. And I think it's important for us to call this out, because as coaches are learning, or if they're not comfortable in this space, it can feel like, oh, I'm supposed to do this, or you haven't had training in this. And some of the things about our coach role and about this particular situation, I think we have to look at a little differently.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So would love to hear a challenge that you've experienced related to last chance coaching. So if and when you're in these engagements, what's something that was challenging for you? And we can start with Tom, if that works.
To me, the biggest challenge is before the coaching starts. It's getting some clarity around like what's really happening here, what's really at stake here, who knows what, like what are you expecting of me? Like that's the biggest challenge because often it has not been great communication. Often the person who's going to get coaching has only heard part of the story and they're putting the story on me. And it's like, wait, I mean, like, am I supposed to deliver this story? Like, why is this my story to tell? Right. Like, so it getting all that stuff clarified up front, to me, that's absolutely the biggest challenge.
And it's looking at it from a systemic standpoint, because is it a bad fit for this particular person you're coaching, or is it their, usually their behavior is not in isolation, right? It's in reaction to something within the system. And I think back to the first time I did this, I did not insist upon having a three-way meeting with the coachee and the sponsor, at the beginning, halfway through, being very clear about what was desired, kind of setting up that contracting ahead of time. And then it became very difficult because in working with the coachee, I'm like, wow, is this really the coachee's challenge, or is this a more a bigger system challenge? And I had not really insisted upon that time with this person's boss. So, I learned from that, and obviously I do it differently now, but that became a big challenge for me of how do I deal with this?
Hey, Susan, can I ask, how
Mhm.
do you do it differently now? Do you actually structure your engagement differently?
I usually ask for, sometimes it's a company I've done a lot of work with, so I know the system. But if not, then I do ask to have a meeting with both the coachee and the sponsor in the beginning, and if possible, middle and definitely end, so that the communication isn't like coming through me, or the expectations coming through me, but the sponsor has to say, this is what we're looking for, or this is what the challenges has been, so that there's transparency in the whole process, and that there's specific behaviors that's been identified. And also, sometimes they want to do a 360, and I find that 360s are very helpful for development, less so when there's derailing behaviors. So I usually work into the contract some doing an interview 360, if you will, at least talking to 3 or 4 people and having those hours kind of included in the contract, so that, as you said, Tom, it's like, what's going on in this situation? What's the truth? What's not the truth? And a coachee that has derailing behaviors, their perception also can be off. So it's kind of trying to find out, get input from different sources.
Mm.
Yes, absolutely. So echoing that, getting that clarity at the beginning is one of the most challenging things. I think determining what you're charging for, if you are external or internal, what your role is, because do you have enough time to get the information? So the 360, the alignment sessions, some of my challenges is I've had alignment sessions where the sponsor doesn't actually say what's happening, but what the problem was told to me in confidence, but it doesn't get revealed. And then the challenge is that then, that one of those, my first one of those did end in termination. And so it was difficult for me as a coach, because it was like, what else could I have done? Could I have impacted that in a different way? But since it's shared with us in confidence, and it's not our role to deliver that message, that can be very challenging.
So listen, this sounds really familiar to me, and I just want to tell you how I deal with it.
You sure?
First off, I am asking all the time when I get the call that says, so and so is in jeopardy, he's too good to fire, but too tough to keep, right? And we need help. Clearly, this is a problem. And what I keep asking over and over and over again is, so what does Ben know?
Exactly.
Exactly.
What has Ben been told? So when we get to the alignment meeting, if suddenly the boss is not saying it in front of Ben, I just call bullshit on it. It's like, I may not do it in that meeting, but I'm certainly going to go back afterwards and go, wait a second, you told me Ben knew everything. Like, that wasn't everything. Like, what?
Yes.
So I spend a lot of time facilitating that, and the coaching hasn't even started yet.
Yes. And that's absolutely part of it. And it also, that made me more hesitant in a way to take these engagements, because it's like, oh, Ben knows. And then you sit down with Ben, and like, Ben's not aware of that necessarily. So that can be very challenging. And then, what I'll also share on another side is, in one of those alignment sessions, there was someone that my questions with the sponsor there, and the sponsor was being very honest, but the honesty in which the sponsor was answering those questions, especially because they had not been in a space facilitated with a coach before, was the person decided to resign because they did not realize the extent of the problem, and then it was very painful for them, even though they were glad that a coach was called in. So just recapping that, the clarity at the beginning, kind of who's saying what, are people even taking this on, coach's level of confidence in how you speak to sponsors about what you do and don't do. There's a lot of this that, to Tom's point, happens even before you start, and those alignment sessions at the beginning and potentially throughout.
Yeah,
So,
the sponsor is hesitant to be direct or open. They don't know, as to your point, Diana, sometimes they don't know how to do it without being harsh. And that's why the interview 360 is helpful, because you can say, you could keep everyone's confidentiality, but the trend is, in talking to 5 people, this is what came up. And that can be helpful. But I like Tom's question of, what does Bob know? What have you told Bob? That's important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also have learned, even if Bob knows, be prepared. I have never been in one of the situations where Bob wasn't surprised. And sometimes it's not new feedback, but the extent to which that potentially their job is on the line can be very difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So, Stephen said before about wanting tools, and I just want to say that I think it's inevitable in this idea of last chance coaching that we as the coach are going to walk in and have difficult conversations, and they may not be very good at it, but we need to be good at it.
Yeah,
we
true.
need to bring those skills to the table and get people talking about stuff they don't usually talk about, because otherwise the coaching is ridiculous. It's like, please, let's not waste our time. But if we can actually get a dialogue going, that's good. And I think that's our job, is to know how to have difficult conversations and do it well and do it without panic. And, because there are going to be a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Tom. So we've talked about some of the challenges. This is definitely emotional. There's challenging things, but curious about a benefit or positive aspect of last chance coaching. And we'll start with Susan.
For me, part of what drives me in coaching is bringing out the best in other people. And there's been times where somebody is very talented and they're just not realizing how they're disrupting the organization with some of their behaviors. Or sometimes they're just in the wrong fit. I was in one situation where, when I talked about business outgrowing somebody, they had outgrown her, but she was kind of frustrated in the position as well. And through the process of that and some team coaching, they decided to reposition her. And so then I went to the company's annual meeting about 6 months later, and she was just glowing. She was happy. She was in this new role where it was very social and welcoming everyone to this event. And, it was just extremely satisfying to see this person just blossom simply because she was put in a different position that used her strengths.
What a nice
So
story.
kind of the reason some of us get into coaching.
Yeah. I'll tell you my story, which is still to this day, I kind of go, this is just a fluke, but it's a great story. So I was given a difficult leader, and the word was, if he keeps this up, we cannot keep him. He was running an enormous lab at a biotech firm and had hundreds of people under him, and he was a tyrant. He was wicked. People were afraid of him. It was, I heard all about it. And I did his 360, and literally, I'm not kidding, I handed him his 360. He read it. And what I'm used to is people reading harsh feedback and going, yeah, I know. I've been hearing that all along. He read it and he was like, I had no idea. I thought I was trying to help. And
Mm.
and by the way, yeah, so he literally changed overnight. It was bizarre. I couldn't believe it. It was like the coaching was over. That's one of the benefits, right? This company didn't have any idea what to do with him, and I give him a 360 and it's over. Like, wow, great. Like, everybody wins on that one, but it was weird.
That's some of the magic of Tom, right?
Yeah.
Right place, right time. I don't know.
Yeah. I will say when this works and it reaches a resolution that is helpful, which is not necessarily the person staying, to Susan transitioning the role. I have just watched leaders grow and change in such an inspirational way.
Oh,
So,
good.
to Tom's point, in either not realizing or their intent doesn't match their impact, and just the partnership that I've seen, and actually the person that I worked with, which is what inspired me to make this course, just watching that person change over time. And then what is interesting to me is, as I've continued as a coach, is how those relationships then turn into other client relationships, whether it's at that organization that originally hired me, that knew that I could come in challenging times, and so let me help them in good times as well, or if someone transitions and then pulls me into another organization. So it's challenging work, but I will say that it's also it's very fulfilling if we're able to be there for people, especially when their jobs are on the line.
Mhm.
Okay. So you've talked about this some already when you talked about contracting and alignment sessions, but what do you need to see before agreeing to one of these engagements? See
Yeah.
or have in place?
There's the language you can have in the contract, but it's also making that sure the spirit's there as far as with the sponsor. What are the behavior changes you're really looking for? Because sometimes they just want the coach to come in and work miracles, and so it's making sure that they understand we're not God. There's the whole system, there's how the coachee's going to react. This may or may not work, and I'm going to work in the best interest of the client as well. So if they decide they want to leave and they're trying to figure out how to exit, then that may be where the coaching engagement goes, but that's probably less cost for you to get this person out anyway. So it's having those kind of conversations and making sure that there is an understanding of what coaching can and cannot do, and that there is a willingness to realize it isn't always as profound and as quick of a change as Tom got to experience. Quite often you'll ask them 8 weeks later or 3 months later, has this changed? And they're like, no, not at all. And I'm like, well, okay, it used to happen how many times a month, and how often is it happening a month now? And you realize it actually has changed. So it's making sure that that understanding is there up front, in addition to whatever things you put in the contract about, three-way discussions and stuff like that, or alignment meetings. I like that title too.
Well, I echo so much of what you just said, Susan. Yeah, what do I need to see? I want to at least hear, what does this really mean? Like, if they don't get better, we're going to fire them. Like, really, what does that really mean? So I want to see that. I also want to clarify, just like you, Susan, of like, what are you expecting me to do? Like, you've had this guy for 10 years. Like, why am I going to come in and change the life in 6 months? Like, what are you expecting here? So I think what I want to see is real clarity. I must say that I do not contract outcomes, but I do want to talk about what's measurable. How are we going to know the difference in 6 months? I mean, like you're going to fire her if what? Right? And do we all agree on that? Like, that's what we should be working on, just that, right? So I want to just get clear.
And the other thing that I've seen quite often is there's a tendency where someone will change. Everyone's happy with the change and say it's over a 6-month period, but they don't believe the change is permanent for like at least a year. So this person's still kind of on probation, if you will, for quite some time. And that's can be very difficult for the coachee because they've done so much work and they've changed so much and they still feel like they're being questioned.
And sometimes if the trust is so broken, that's a whole different repair process. So it's been interesting for me in interviewing different coaches and having the gift of having different panelists is that, just learning from different coaches and what they do. So yeah, the term alignment sessions, that came from another coach, right? This is why community is so valuable. So one coach actually contracts that if the person gets terminated, that they stay with them as career coaching, that it's already paid. So I thought that was something that's interesting. Looking at, I think some people think about, are you requiring a 360? Is it a certain time duration? One of the most common responses I get for why people don't offer this is they'll say, well, they're just trying to check the box. They're just trying to check the box that they did an intervention because they're firing someone anyway. And that is the most common reason I hear for reasons that people don't take this on. What my response to that is, but who better than us, who does not work for the company, to challenge the sponsor to say, hey, you're asking me to check this box, but are you actually hoping for change? So I thankfully have worked with amazing sponsors in my career, but I know a lot of the hesitation on this one is people think that the sponsor's just checking the box. To me, that's not a deal breaker because we can potentially challenge the sponsor and we can potentially offer coaching. And that may be too kind of bright-eyed and bushy-tailed for some people, but I think it's worth looking at. And, for people watching this panel, this is not to sway you either way. It's just to kind of lay out the foundation that the contracting, the clarity, and then also some of these things that may cause us to press pause. I think another thing that we maybe don't articulate, but we're encouraged as coaches to feel is intuitively. If the situation doesn't feel right, if it doesn't feel like it's a fit, if we meet the leader and the leader doesn't seem to be engaged. So there's a moment for me in the alignment session where the sponsor leaves the room and I just talk to the leader. And the first thing I say is like, do you want to do this? Do you want to stay? Because it's not, we can't coach someone that doesn't want to be coached. So that really those foundational things actually take us into the next question. So as far as like particular core competencies or things that you leverage in these engagements, stuff that's already come up is contracting. So establishing the coaching agreement and that being so important. Tom talked about difficult conversations. What other kind of core coach components do you see specifically in these engagements?
I mean, definitely, ethics, confidentiality, there needs to be transparency. And I've had people ask me questions where my answer is, it's not my place to speak for them. And it's not my place to not hold their confidentiality. But at the same time, I may be coaching the coachee and I'm like, is that something that you're considering public knowledge and it's okay for me to share, or you don't want me to share? So it's just having those conversations, but always so focusing on the ethics, confidentiality, and always being, client-centered will keep you out of trouble, is what I've found.
Amen.
Great.
Yeah. Yeah, the confidentiality issue is, I think, extremely difficult. And if we're talking about competencies, I'm not trying to drive us there right now, but I just want to say there are some serious challenges there, I think. that I would be interested to talk about at some point.
And, you know, and I'm kind of by nature more of a people pleaser. So you're like wanting to answer them, but I've just got to the point where it's not appropriate for me to answer that question.
Yeah.
And I don't say it this way, but you know, there is a certain value of hiring an ICF certified coach because we do abide by a code of ethics. That's one of our, you know, should be selling factors for being certified. But with that means we have to abide by those ethics with the sponsor.
Yeah, and what, as you talk about confidentiality, another thing that comes up and is very prominent for me is just the cultivating trust and safety. Because the thing is that, you know, some of the reason why the sponsor was asking those questions, right? Are they safe to share? What gets shared? And then also, you know, I have had someone say to me, my boss hired you to fire me, right? And so, because my first thing is out the gate is, you know, is this something you want to work on? You know, can we work together? You know, to which my response is, look, this is, you know, I understand why you feel that way. And I know that this is a shock, but also this investment was made in hopes that there could be a better resolution. And then there's a point where we also just have to let the client decide if the trust is there, especially when in these engagements, usually the trust is broken. So I think kind of the contracting, the ethics, and the cultivating the trust and safety, and then also to Tom's point, the difficult conversations and being able to call things out directly really come into prevalence in these discussions.
I mean, I went through the different competencies and I could see that I had used every single one of them in my engagements. So
yeah. Curious if any, you know, if any competencies feel like they're missing. Like, is there anything in our coaching that's not in this context that we feel shows up, I guess doesn't show up? Because one of the things we'll do in this class is look at how the ICF competencies apply. And to Susan's point, I think they're all in there. Every coaching session has all of them. So it's okay if the answer to this question is just no. But does it feel like there are any kind of competencies that are missing when you're doing last chance coaching?
The very last competency of helping them learn to grow and so forth, you know, sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't, which is usually the case when you know they do get fired, and there may be some growth there, but not usually at the time of coaching do you see it as much as you do if you're starting out in an engagement that's more development focused versus let's get rid of, you know, derailing behaviors first and then do development. You don't get quite as far along. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, that resonates. I think one of the things that came up as well as far as competencies that are used is coach role, right? Determining what is and isn't the coach role, and what we can and can't do. So looking at that from a scope perspective. So, but that's a good point, because especially I think sometimes there can be, you know, and this is why supervision is so valuable. There can be that desire to serve, to help, to support, to see the client's growth. We get to be in that space and appreciate and enjoy that. And sometimes in these engagements that may not be present, or you may not be able to see it at the time, because so much of coaching happens outside of the coaching sessions. And sometimes these engagements are cut short.
Yeah.
So curious, what is something you wish you had known as a coach before taking on these engagements? I mean, a lot of these best practices you've already covered, but does this question evoke any additional best practices or insights?
Oh, listen, I've learned it over the years and I've gotten better at it. But what I wish I had been better at earlier was what I talked about, was difficult conversations, setting really clear boundaries. I mean, making sure that I knew how to kind of not get sucked into the vortex. That's what I wish I had just been better at, and I learned it on the job.
And for me, it's also having, I mean, I think it's I've done a lot more team coaching and some team certifications, and that's just raised my awareness of the whole, system that's involved. And I think the first few assignments I took of this, I wasn't focused enough on the system and how this person is operating within the system versus just let's coach this person as if they're an isolated problem or potential.
My complimentary piece to that about the system is that I have no idea who the players really are. Whoever first contacts me, that's the story I hear first, but I don't believe that it's true. Do you know what I mean? It's just that person's report. But I need to talk to a whole bunch of other people before I even talk to the person I'm going to coach. Like, what's going on? And I don't want to say I don't trust people. I just don't. I know that everybody's telling the story from their point of view, that it's really kind of Rashomon. So it's like, and then I get to hear from the client. And you know what? Sometimes they're all right. And sometimes the client's just like a mess. And then it is an interesting situation when they come back to you and go, how do you experience her? It's like, what am I going to say here? Right? Really, what am I going to say?
Mm-hmm.
It's hard. It's really hard. And by the way, I just want to tell you, I spent a lot of time preparing for those conversations, even if they never happen, because I assume they're going to happen, and I don't want to get caught off guard. I don't want to shoot from the hip.
And then the other thing, to Tom's point about having to talk to so many people to figure out what's going on, I've learned to get that time in the contract, whereas there was some engagements where I'm spending copious amounts of time interviewing different people, and I'm not being compensated for that extra time.
Oh, that's interesting. And I always just have a package price. I'm whatever. You win some and you lose some,
Yeah.
And I'm just saying I just do it differently. So I don't charge that way.
Yeah, and that's some of the value. That's why I like different voices on the panel, because
me too. Yeah.
That's the thing, right? It's diversity and the different things that resonate. Yeah, a lot of echoing what you said, or amen, as Tom said. I definitely learned a lot about the contracting. I learned a lot about the system, because so rarely, it'll be presented as this person. If this person fixes this, then we're good, right? And that's, it's a lot more complicated than that. And what also, and this came up when someone shared this about their desired takeaways from this class, the impact to me as a coach, and the impact to me as an internal coach when someone was terminated and wondering, could I have done something else? And thankfully I had a manager who was a mentor coach who helped me through that. And then also the challenge as well of tackling that as an entrepreneur when it was revenue that I was counting on. So these engagements, both in a positive way and also in some ways in a negative way, have impacted me a lot. And I think part of the reason and the value of, I think, coaching supervision, as we look at how do things impact the coach, and that we need to look at that. It's not just, we show up and we coach and it has no emotional impact, or we have no stake in the game. So that was something that I feel like I really learned through this process. Yeah.
I just want to say, for me, I think of it around my own kind of self-care and my boundaries. I think of it a little differently, which is I don't get terribly emotionally, like it's going to be hard to upset me, but I often find that I think about those clients a lot, because it's so politically complicated, and like, how can I help, and who am I actually helping here, by the way? Like, really getting my priorities straight. So I find they take a lot of my brain power, but I don't get terribly emotional about them anymore. I just want to say
anymore. And that's some of the examples I'm sharing are earlier in my career, because I do think, when, especially as we train and support coaches that are just starting out, or is that, there's such a desire for impact. And so, some of what comes from experience, and this kind of experience, is we know it's not personal. We know there's only so much we can do. We know going in that these are potentially high stakes engagements that may not end with a pretty bow on them. But thinking as a newer coach, that can be harder to bear. Yeah, great. So curious, how does choosing to offer or not offer this align with your values or something that's important to you?
I mean, I think I said at the beginning, one of my values is that everyone has a chance to use their talents in their job, and to really leverage what they're best at. And so quite often I see with the last chance coaching, usually they don't call somebody in to coach unless there is something really strong attributes of this person. So for me, I kind of look at it as helping that person fit in and being able to really use their strengths, where right now they've got something that's getting in the way of that. So for me, it really does align with my value of why I coach and bringing out the best in everyone. I don't think I've ever been called in to coach for somebody who is such a mess that that there isn't some strength that hasn't been able to bubble up to the top. I mean, that's usually why they have a coach, is, as Tom said of one of his assignments, it's somebody that they don't want to let go because they have so much good skill set, but there's just a behavior problem.
The people that I coach in general, it's not going to be like at the end of the coaching, the person gets fired. It's going to be more complex than that. So just because things move slower, and you know what I mean, it's like things tend to be bigger, where the coaching ends, and I don't always know what's going to happen at that point. And suddenly I'm gone, and that's odd. It's odd to not know the end of the story.
Yeah, good
Coach
point.
Quite often a better coach if we don't have attachment to the outcome. So
I know, right? I
But
know.
listen, I'll be honest.
Easier said than done.
Yeah, there are times when where I think like the boss is a hot mess, and like, you know what I mean? And somebody's getting caught up in something, and it's like, but really it's the boss is wacko or whatever, where I'm aware that just as a human being, I've kind of picked sides, or even against my client, thinking like, my client does create chaos. I'm listening to her. She's a chaos maker. Like, yeah. I mean, I had a woman that I really thought she had a personality disorder. Now, I'm not a doctor, and I'm never going to say that to anybody, but like, I didn't think she was coachable. Do I go back to, I mean, this is in one of the studios where it's like, uh, we don't take this lightly. Am I going to go back and say, I think you should fire her ass? Like, but I didn't think she was safe in the workplace, actually. What's my obligation at that point?
That's very
Mhm.
Right? Like, what is my obligation? It's just my opinion. And I'm no doctor. So it was hard. It was really hard.
Yeah. And it can be especially challenging, I found, is that when our opinion is based on confidential information. And so I've reached out to the ethics board for that reason, and my ethics professor to have that dialogue, because especially if you're solo in an engagement, or the most experienced coach, and it's part of why we're here in community, right? Because knowing, hey, was that navigated? What did you learn? I think that that's so valuable. So thank you for sharing that. So what I'll just put in the chat is just a sentiment from one of the panelists who couldn't join us. So, philosophically, I'm opposed to this type of coaching. I think the intent is great, but most organizations do this as a check off the box, and the managers don't really believe there can be change and are just covering their bases. So this comes from someone who has experience doing it, but also for them at this point, it's a hard no. And I just want to honor that and honor that voice, because that's also why we do this as a panel, because it is important for us to have coaching skill and to be able to navigate these different situations. But then also, I think ideally, especially as we establish ourselves as coaches and continue to grow in our experience, that we can be coming from a place of choice and be like, hey, is this client, is this time, is this topic a match for me, or does it not feel like a fit? So the last plan question, and then I'll invite our class to come forward and share some of their questions. And thank you so much for the time. But curious, what's your takeaway? You've had these engagements throughout your career. What's a takeaway from this type of engagement for you?
I'll just say it requires a certain bravery because things are a mess and I don't want to make it worse. And I could easily make it worse. One more person just, right? But I don't want to make it worse. So yeah, I take it quite seriously and I think it needs some bravery.
I think so.
And I mean, I will agree with that. It is a tough engagement versus someone who has a development plan and there's things they want to do and you've got the structure and you just, bump along. You don't always know what you're going to get or what's going to come up or where the chaos is coming from. You have to be a really curious person and just be centered in, I'm going to do the best I could do, and that's all I can do. I can't work miracles. So
yeah, thank you. Boundaries, limits. Yes. Yeah, I will say, some people say that we learn the most about people when they're at their worst. And I will say, having this is a level of partnership that I've had with some of my clients, where I really feel to step in this ring with them, so to speak, was a really meaningful experience. And then also, I was bumped and bruised and I've learned, and I'm thankful for panelists such as yourself for coming and sharing their experience, because also, even though this has been something that I've learned from the hard way, to be able to be with other coaches and community and to learn different best practices and different approaches has been so helpful. So I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for coming. And if there's folks that have questions for our panel, feel free to hop on video if you're comfortable coming on video. Just note that this is being recorded. So as long as you're comfortable with being on video, otherwise you can put questions in the chat. We have a little bit of time for questions for our panelists. And I know there was a question about when the alignment session happens. Jamie, did you feel that was answered, or would you like us to go in depth a little bit more on that?
Yeah, thank you. I just was typing and I have a question. I'm curious if either of you always insist on that, meeting of 3. Do you always insist on having a meeting with the person being coached potentially, as well as the manager or HR professional? Do you require that there be a meeting together at the same time so that you can sense whatever dynamic may be going on beyond the words? Or do you meet with people separately?
If I don't know the organization, I definitely want it in the contract. Does it always happen? I'll be honest, not always. But if it doesn't happen, or if I don't, push for it to happen, if they're resisting, it's usually because things are going well. But at least it's in the contract, so I can push for that if that's needed, if I feel like there's just a lack of transparency. But transparency sometimes can happen without the 2 people in the room with me at the exact same time. Mm-hmm. So sometimes I'll push it and sometimes I won't. It just depends. But at least I've set that expectation up front.
Thank you.
So Jamie, for me, my standard contract is a 360, an assessment, and an alignment meeting and an exit meeting. It's not a negotiable. It just happens. It happens to every person that I coach, unless there's some circumstance. Things change all the time. But so it's always standard for me, always. Okay.
Tom, what did you say after alignment meeting? You mentioned an
exit meeting. In other words, we're going to
meet at the beginning.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both very much. So interesting. And I appreciate the diversity of your perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. I agree. Thanks.
Yeah, and Jamie, I'll just add, I speak to this person, the sponsor or the manager, kind of opting them in separately first, and then usually meeting with them together is the kickoff, because it also helps me see the sponsor always thinks they know. I've told them they're the problem, but it does help you learn a lot about the organization and their relationship. So I wouldn't, while like Tom and Susan, I always recommend alignment sessions, even when it's not last chance coaching. The difficulty without the alignment sessions is you can't measure it and assume that everything that the employee knows about the situation, they don't actually know. I've never been in one of these situations without some element of surprise. So I think if it's, I think what's good is Tom and Susan are also reflecting, there's a certain point of flexibility. Hey, it's in the contract, it's in the pricing. If at a certain point they refuse, I think if they're refusing to sit down with you as a group, I've never had even like high trust manager and employee, I still am going to ask questions that they don't normally talk about at a level that they don't normally discuss. So I wouldn't proceed without it, or don't recommend proceeding without it. But again, like they've said, it's a judgment call, but for this type, I wouldn't. I think you want to question whether you want to take the engagement if they won't meet with you together.
Yeah.
We had a question in the chat, and then I'll pass it to Michael. Stephen, did you want to ask it? Otherwise, I'll read it out.
Go ahead, be my guest.
Okay. So how do you deal with the situation where the coachee's purported lack of job performance is really due to a lack of clarity on their job description at time of hire?
Stephen asked that question. Do you mean they took the job thinking it was one thing and it's really something else and it's a bad fit, or because they don't understand what's expected of them?
Could be either.
Okay.
But not every organization has a human resources manager. Not every organization has clear job descriptions. People are sometimes held accountable for doing certain things, but there's no clarity. They didn't know that was part of their expectations. So how do you deal with that after the fact?
I mean, that goes to the situations where that was the case is the same situations where I've said that somebody was just really a bad fit for the role they're in. And that usually comes up pretty quickly. And, and that's where the alignment meetings can make a big difference as well, is that you can bring that out into the open of, this person's great at sales. You said you were hiring for sales and now you're asking them to do marketing, and to have those discussions, which are not easy discussions because, the company's they're trying to there's a reason why they've done it quite often, because their focus has changed and they still like the person and they want to use the person, but they don't really kind of realize what they've done to ask this person to operate in a role which was not what they thought they were being hired for. Going back to sometimes it's not the person that's a problem, it's the system.
Yep.
Stephen, I don't know that real example, but one of the things that I think is possible is to coach the coachee to go have the conversation. Like if you think it's not right, talk to your boss. Like, this is your job, figure it out. Like, and to coach them to have that conversation.
Yeah. So in line with that, oh, sorry, Susan.
I was just role playing is a good, tactic to be able to do for that too.
Yeah. If it's revealed in the alignment session, so that's part of the value of the alignment session, you can say, like, it sounds like we're not on the same page here, or it sounds like so you can actually reflect it back and call it out. And you as a neutral party being able to call out that discrepancy can be helpful. But then if it doesn't get revealed until after the fact, because oftentimes in the alignment session, the employee is quiet, and, getting to know them and what's important to them and whether they want to engage or not may not happen until after the alignment session. So then to Tom's point, do you feel safe enough to say? If you don't feel safe enough to say, what are we going to work on? because that's at a core issue.
Okay.
Stephen, does that address your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Michael, please.
Yeah, well, first of all, I just want to say thank you, Diana, for putting this on. I'm learning a lot, and I'm learning that there are a lot of things that I could do differently. So I recently kind of landed myself into a situation like this that I wasn't looking for, but kind of came looking for me. And one of the things that's coming to my mind is so I'm told that by the chief HR officer that another executive in the organization needs to have some coaching because he's creating problems within the organization and his attitude and all these things. Well, then I meet with the guy after a lot of like changed appointments and so forth. I meet with him, and what he tells me is, "Oh, well, I'm the rainmaker around here. And by the way, I never met any of these people. Like they've cleaned house. They've cleaned house like all the other executives on the team. They completely cleaned house. I'm the last, remaining of the old guard, so to speak. And I think they're trying to get rid of me as well. But the first time I even met the chief HRO, like, was when I was told I was having these problems. And so I guess my question for the panel is, how would you handle something like this? Now that I've already said, yeah, I'll coach this guy, and I've already taken their money. So, and the guy still hasn't shown up to his first appointment. His meeting was supposed to be Thursday, and he had COVID. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. I don't know, but I need some advice.
I don't know how you win. I don't know how you will measure success here.
Yeah, it's I could tell you a million things that are 2020, right, of what you could have done different in setting up the engagement. It is one area where, what do you do now? You could coach that employee to go have a talk with the HR person. You could ask for if you'd like to have a three-way with the HR person. I mean, somehow it needs to come out that this dynamic is there, and you can't do that by yourself, or you're going to break confidentiality. But you can say, I'm hearing things differently from both of you. How do you want to resolve that?
Michael, here's just a last thought for you. I would ask your client and the people who have hired you, it sounds like the HR person, I would ask them individually, separately, how they would measure success for the coaching, and then see whether you can contract to that. But figure it out, like, what does success look like? Because they may have very different ideas, in which case that's your opportunity to talk.
Okay.
Yeah, and what I'll say from a contracting perspective, congratulations on getting paid up front, because that's potentially something that you want to put in these types of situations.
Or not. I just want to say,
or not. Okay, good perspective. So, I think if and when you're meeting with this person, how does he define success? What is he looking for? It does sound like there's an issue of safety, right? It's yes, you're being told there are these behaviors to address, but it also does sound like this particular executive is the last standing of the old guard and feels like it's time to jump ship. And so what you've promised in your contract, as far as kind of who the client is from an ICF perspective, we say the client is the person being coached, not the sponsor. But then also, depending on your contract and what it says about refunds, or can they apply this elsewhere? Does the contract just terminate? That's when that kind of contracting language, and of course also what you feel comfortable with, but where that contracting language really comes into play. Because, I worked with an organization, I did decide to give that organization credit for something else. But something I didn't do was put an expiration date on that credit. So then years later, when I charged a lot more and they came back, I decided to honor it because it was local client, local business. And I didn't feel that engagement went well. but also, it's now my contracts have a timestamp. So this is when I think a lot of what coaching education sometimes doesn't prepare coaches for is what actually goes in the contract, so that we have that safety not only for the client but for us, but that really kind of makes an impact here.
And you're constantly contracting with the sponsor and the client too, every session, right? What are we doing today? And do I have your permission to interrupt you or whatever? You're contracting with them. Always be contracting, ABC. And to Diana's point, most training programs don't really talk about that much. But in supervision, almost every problem we talk about ends up coming back to that over and over again.
Great. Well, just for the sake of, we have another question in there, but just for the sake of time, I just want to honor, I want to say thank you to our panelists. So thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight. If you're able to stay for an additional question, Tiffany, do you want to come forward or do you want me to read?
I could come forward.
Okay.
This was just building off of what Michael had shared. And that was the part where the client didn't show up for the meetings. Would the no-show clause be the same here and the no refunds, or as you would normally contract out, or does it change for this situation?
Just, can I?
Yeah, it's just personal.
So sorry for jumping in, Susan. For me, it shows up really, really early, like really before we've launched anything. Just like getting someone to do a 360 means that they have to be communicating with me, and I can tell right away whether they're doing it or not. And if it goes long enough that literally I can't get any traction, I will tell the person, listen, let me just check this out again. Let me go back to HR. Let me make sure everything's in place. So they know I'm doing it. I'm not doing it behind their back. And I go back and I say, listen, I've got no traction here. I need some help, or let's stop. So, and with one person, by the way, we stopped. I tried to get in touch with this guy for months, literally. And finally I said, I'm out. Like, here's your money back. I'm done. Like, I'm not doing this, because he was a no-show, and that was my choice. But it took me a long time. It took months for that to happen.
And I did put in my contract that one thing that's not confidential is that I can report back to the sponsor what appointments we've had, whether they were in person or virtual or phone, just some basic things like that, so that if then there is no shows, I can talk to the sponsor and I'm not breaking any confidentiality because I put that expectation up front.
Right.
Tiffany, I'll just add one thing, if I may. What I'm talking about, this no-show, is kind of like literally somebody does not show up for their coaching engagement at the start. And so the coaching just gets off very badly. As opposed to, for example, an individual session and a no-show, which I treat completely differently. So,
good point.
So I just want to be sure that we're clear about, you know what I mean? Like, when somebody doesn't show up for a single appointment, but I kind of have a sense like something must have gone wrong. I mean, right? Like, we've been going fine. I'm going to deal with that by itself. It's not, I don't consider that. It is a no-show, but it's just different. Sorry.
No, not at all. Yeah, and in line with that. So if someone is or isn't coming to the session, is one of the only things I report to the sponsor. And I say that up front. It's not something I've had to report, but then also at a certain point, and this is not a last chance engagement, if at a certain point they've had a number of last minute cancellations, or, it's not usually no show, it's more kind of last minute cancellations. My language is may result in loss of the session, especially if I keep showing up for the session and they're not, so that I'm covered. But I usually give people a free pass. But there are also people that I've opted out of coaching to just be like, hey, we've had 3 sessions that, had to be rescheduled at the last minute. If you're interested in working together, let your HR person know, just so that I'm not continuously billing.
On that point, I've worked for a friend of mine on the East Coast who has a coaching company. And over the years, I've watched her develop her contracts, and her contract now is fantastic. What she sends to the person being coached: these are your responsibilities. This is the coach's responsibilities. And it's so helpful, because look, maybe they don't read it, but it's there, and it's about stuff like showing up and giving 24 hours notice, and it's all that stuff, and it's friendly, but it's great, and I don't have to have the conversation, you know, and it's meant for them. It's meant for the coachee. It's great. It's really helpful.
Great. Thank you. Any takeaways and thank yous that people would like to share as we wrap our panel? I recognize we're got a lot of East Coast, so it's getting a little late.
Diana, I'll share one. I think it was Susan that said it a little bit earlier, but it really stood out to me. We're better coaches when we don't have any attachment to the outcome, and particularly for last chance coaching, when the success to failure ratio is probably a little skewed, more so than other coaching engagements. I think that was a nice reassurance to hear. So that's my takeaway.
Thanks, Rusty.
I'll share. It might sound a little cliche. Hey, Tom.
Hi, Paul.
But as the saying goes, well begun is half done. Just with this work, just setting up, making explicit all the different things, thinking about everything that possibly can go wrong, and being willing to have those conversations, like Tom says, upfront and early, is really important. And it also makes just a wonderful case for coach supervision as well.
Yes, and Paul's a supervisor. So there you go.
And a good one.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time and sharing your experience with us. I will just say for myself, having had these conversations over a number of years, just hearing your voices and your perspectives and the way that you're looking at it is just so helpful for people new, but then also for myself as someone who's experienced in this. So Tom, Susan, thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And happy to have anyone connect with me on LinkedIn, and you could throw me if it comes up tomorrow or something.
Absolutely. Great. Please. My pleasure.
Thank you both.